And welcome back. We previously looked at our very first animation using Adobe Animate. Now we did explore this new concept, which is something known as a tween, but we didn't really dive into it. We didn't really sink our teeth into it too much other than to make that rectangle kind of rotate a little bit. So let's go ahead and do the same thing again. And for today's purpose, let's just go ahead and give our good old HD 720. We're going to leave it as Action Script 3 here. And when we create this canvas here now, I'm going to actually bring my timeline back down just a little bit so I can see just a little bit more of this. And what I want to do now is set this up. So we're going to use the Poly Star tool here. So underneath the rectangle tool, we see the Poly Star tool option. Now, if you're drawing this and you're not getting a star, it's because over here in your tool options, you might still be set to polygon. And of course, if I draw a polygon, this one is 5 sides. You, of course, can change the number of sides by simply coming over here and clicking and typing in whatever size. So, for example, if I wanted an octagon, I could do 8, and of course, I would have an octagon. But we want a star for today's purpose and exercise. Now, we, of course, can control different things about this star. So, for example, if I were to draw a multi-point star here, you can see we have 8 star points here, but let's just say we want to just do a regular star. So, let's just go ahead and make this back to 5 points. And when I draw that star in here, we can see our border might be a little thin for a taste. So, of course, we have options such as increasing stroke size. So, let's say I want to make my stroke size more, let's say 2. And if I were to draw that alongside this one, you can see that we have a star with a little thicker border. And I kind of like that one just a little bit more just because it's a little more visible. And again, you can kind of play around with it. I'm just going to delete these two out of here. Go back to my star tool. And let's go ahead and I'm going to change the fill of this one to more of a yellow fill. And when I draw this in here, of course, it's not a gradient anymore. So it's because we overwrote that option. So if we want to change that, let's just go ahead and draw our star. Here he is. And I'm going to make that with a gradient. So let's go ahead and bring back our color window here. And let's switch this to kind of more a radial gradient, because maybe I want that to be more yellow or white in the center here. So the white is good, but I'm going to change these two swatch options. So I'm going to have the middle be kind of more of a light yellow, and I'm going to make this other darker color more of this more solid yellow. So that looks pretty good here. And then let's go ahead and fill that star in. And of course, you can see we now have those lighter colors there with the darker colors in the middle. All right, just add some nice texture to it. Now, let's go ahead and make the star move. So to do that, let's go ahead and go down to our timeline. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add in my frames just as I did before. I could do 1 second, but today let's actually go 1.5 seconds. So we're going to go to 45 frames. And if I insert frames, now of course we can have the option to make this star move. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click here on the timeline, and I'm going to choose the very first option, which is Create Classic Tween. And when I create a Classic Tween, we get this pop-up that shows up, and all it's going to tell us it has to be a symbol, because when we just draw these shapes in here, they're very primitive. They're just shapes. They're not actually things that we can manipulate, and have convert into animations. So they have to become a symbol. So this is fine. So we're just going to click OK. And you can see that our timeline now, of course, has those trademark little dots there. And if I were to move this through this timeline, of course, you can see nothing happens. All right, and that's because this star is effectively where it's at the very beginning of the timeline is also where it's at the end of the timeline. So if I go to the end of the timeline right now, and I would just use my selection tool here, I can click and drag this star, and let's just say I want to move him from the top corner to the bottom corner. And then I were to play this animation, you can see that that star now will slide across the screen from one corner to the other. Now that's pretty cool, and it doesn't matter where he starts. So for example, if I were to move him to this other corner and play that animation, you can see that it will retain wherever that starting and end position currently are mapped to, which is pretty nice. Now the one downside of this is that this Classic Tween is only good for straight lines unless we use what's called a motion path. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm actually going to remove my Classic Tween here. All right, and delete off that keyframe. So let's just go ahead and clear that right out. So clear keyframe. And we are going to go ahead and introduce to another layer here. So I'm going to rename this layer to star, just so I can keep track, and add a new layer and let's call this layer motion guide. All right. Now it says such characters not permitted, so I probably put a space in here or something that it didn't like. So I just need to make sure when I do that, I can just use like an underscore, and that will solve that problem. Now the next key thing here to remember is that this motion guide layer is not going to be a regular layer. What we actually want to do here is right click on this, and you can see that we have the option to add classic motion guide. We also have the option for guide, and guide is perfectly fine for us to use. So once I click on guide, you will see that the layer icon is no longer that piece of paper with the folded corner, but instead has changed to a totally new symbol. And that means that we now have our guide in place. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the very first frame of my animation, and I'm going to go ahead and go to my pen tool here. And all I'm going to do with my pen tool is I'm going to go ahead and draw the path that I want that star to go. So let's say, for example, I want my star again. So let's actually just go back to our selection tool here. I want to start at the top here, and I want to end up in this bottom corner still. But what I want to do is I want that star to kind of fall in a spiraling path. So click on the motion guide layer, go to your pen tool, and we're going to approximately just kind of draw this from the center of this star here and draw kind of a spiraling path. So I'm just going to go ahead, and you can see if I try doing that, we're not getting quite what we want here. All right, because you notice when we're drawing this, we are getting it's effectively just trying to draw on this shape. And that's not what we want. What we want to do is have this pen actually draw a motion guide path. Now the reason why the pen tool is not working is because it's not a tool designed for what we want to do. The pen tool is strictly much more for drawing. So down here you might see these 3 ellipses here, and if I click on that, we have more tools that are available to us. And I'm going to go ahead and grab the pencil tool here. So let's go ahead and click on this little guy right here and go ahead and drag him here underneath our pen tools just to add him to our toolbar here. All right. And what that's going to allow us to do now is it allows us to draw this in here. Now, of course, we have different styles with the pencil tool that we can work with. But, of course, now I can just kind of come in here, and you'll notice that it will function pretty easily where we can go ahead and draw this spiral path. All right. And, of course, once that's in there, it will give us kind of a nice path. Now, it might not give you the smoothest path because it will try to render that out into what it thinks approximate is. So you may have to play around with the smoothing here, for example. You can see my smoothing right now is set to 50. So you may have to play around with some of these pencil options to really kind of get that desired path that you're going for. But again, it's not necessarily needing to be perfect because again, right now we're just learning for the purpose of this exercise. All right, once you have your path drawn though, now the next thing to do is to go back to our star layer here, and now we can create that classic tween. And you'll see what happens is right now that classic tween is applied, but it hasn't actually applied to that shape yet. So actually let's undo that here just for a second, because if I grab this star here, you'll notice that it's not anchored to this path. So I'm going to actually remove the motion or the classic tween again. And what I want to do is I want to make sure that first this star is anchored to this point here. And I want to make sure that it is anchored to that. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually drag the star layer so it's underneath the motion guide layer. And you can see when I do that, you can see how we kind of get the symbol for the motion guide changing yet again. And what will happen is that now this is going to recognize that this layer needs to belong to this path here. And so now when we go ahead and create our classic tween, and I go ahead and make this to the end, notice I'm needing another keyframe here, so let's go ahead and insert that keyframe. Now when I go to the end, to the very last frame, we should be having the option where it's looking to kind of snap to the end of that timeline. So then when I trace this back, you will see that the star now will play along that timeline path. So if we press play, you can see the star will now move along the path that I have drawn, all because we have applied that motion guide. Now I will say sometimes I've had students come to me and have struggles with this. Again, my biggest hint here is going to be when you're working with making this motion guide, the very important thing is first make your star, then make the motion guide and draw the path. Then the next thing to do is to make sure that you have put this star layer underneath the motion guide. All right, it's very important that it's underneath the motion guide layer because if it's not, the two layers will not be linked. Then after you've done that, then go ahead and create your Classic Tween here, so that that Classic Tween can then map and follow the path that you have created, and of course making sure it goes from beginning all the way to the end. And that's going to wrap things up. Next time when we come back, we're going to take a look at a couple other tweens. Particularly the next tween we want to examine is the shape tween, which we have seen already, but we're going to go ahead and look at it with a little bit more finesse.